Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paved with Good Intentions, the show that asks the difficult questions you didn't think you cared about, like today's topic where we're talking about superheroes. As always, I'm Danielle Kessner, and this episode is produced sponsor free, so thank you for supporting independent artists. Like I said, today I'm going to be talking about superheroes, or specifically superhero movies, and how to make a successful superhero film in the age of excess. That is, in the age where pretty much every week we're seeing a new superhero movie coming out. So, how is it that we have managed to not get that superhero movie fatigue that we thought was going to come early on in the superhero franchise ramp up in the mid 2000s, with the rise of the MCU and all that? How is it that we have not gotten sick of it? Now, that's assuming that you aren't already sick of it. Some of you might be completely over the whole superhero thing, but a lot of us still enjoy the movies for what they are and have found that there are actually some good ones that are coming out. But I want to look at how we can actually endure this for much longer, knowing that obviously there will be a breaking point where we will say enough is enough. But studios can also react to that without necessarily changing their format. They can still rely on superhero movies as a good way to get people in theaters, but they are going to have to adapt. So that's what I'm going to look at today. How to make a successful superhero film in the age of excess. Now, in case you missed it, Wonder Woman arrived with a vengeance recently to great reviews, a lot of money, and excellent reaction from the fans. And for good reason, because it has a lot going for it. The action is fun, the story is compelling, the cast is stacked with great actors. But there's something even more basic about why it landed with audiences. Wonder Woman is successful because it is the first female-led superhero movie in the modern age. Now that might sound silly or even a little bit sexist depending on where you're coming from, but it's also true. Half of the movie-going audience is women. Whether you believe it or not, half of the population out there is women. And this is the first major movie to appeal to that audience in the superhero genre. But the movie isn't just for women. It's universal enough to really land with everyone who watches it. And yet still, Warner Brothers miscalculated its impact. Though Warner Brothers is pretty much synonymous with miscalculation at this point after movies like Batman v Superman and Suicide Squad. She isn't the first significant big screen action hero, though, so it's not like this is the first time ever we've had a female lead as the action hero. We've had them for the last 40, 50 years. You think of characters like Ripley. Ripley probably holds that title, and then you get like Sarah Connor. We've also seen, more females in recent years like Katniss Everdeen, Rey from Star Wars, Jyn Erso from Rogue One, and upcoming we've got Atomic Blonde, which is basically a female version of John Wick. But some are still relegated to support roles, like Black Widow has been throughout the MCU. Even with these leading characters, some of them aren't given a lot of freedom to be more than just a female lead. And I point specifically to Katniss Everdeen because it's probably the most explicit example. So much of her character is defined by her love interest, which obviously that doesn't necessarily translate to a strong female character if so much of her emotional weight is dependent solely on the male character. I also disagree with the male character she chose. I thought Peeta was not that great of a character. Still, the ratio of male to female leads is extremely unbalanced. But the overall project it's the overall project for Wonder Woman that's really impressive. And you can actually watch my YouTube review for more specifics because I don't want to get into all of that. And a lot of that credit is due to director Patty Jenkins. It's not an accident that a female director-screenwriter can present a female character as well as we get with Wonder Woman. A lot of that has to do with the fact that Patty Jenkins can give us that perspective as a director and as a screenwriter. However, the movie is still cliche in a lot of ways. It breaks from many precedents like the pacing, the story, the character relationships, things that we are pretty much used to at this point in superhero movies. Some of them, the pacing especially is one of those things that we don't get this kind of pacing a lot in superhero movies, but the character relationships, it's almost like flipping what we normally see, because normally it's the man who's very matter of fact, and the man is really the one who is directing the story, where in this case, it's definitely Wonder Woman. And so I give a lot of the credit to Patty Jenkins for doing that. But despite all of its positives, it's also a very safe movie. And it, again, I'm not convinced that Warner Brothers believed it would play well with a wide audience, and so they said, make sure you keep it safe with things like a predictable third act. The third act is just a CGI slugfest, and it a lot of ways reminds you a lot of Captain America: The First Avenger. And if you remember, if it makes you think of that, you're not wrong, because even the ending of these movies have some pretty close parallels. It's also more humorous than other DCEU movies, so like it's way funnier than something like Batman v Superman, and even Suicide Squad, which tried to be funnier, but it just did not have a story that made any sense. And it's also the kind of lighthearted humor that everyone can enjoy, which Suicide Squad definitely was not. This one is a little bit more, anybody can go into this and really enjoy the kind of humor that they present. So again, I got to give a lot of that credit to Patty Jenkins. Much like another surprise hit, Deadpool, it was a big risk, although more financially so than Deadpool was. This definitely cost a lot more to make than Deadpool did, because they really did not think Deadpool was going to be successful. And so, obviously, to be financially safe, they made it as appealing as they could. And while that safe production doesn't diminish the strengths of this movie, it does keep it from ascending to the elite of films, at least like the best superhero films that we can think of. At least for now. I'm not saying it won't ever, but at least right now, when I think of the best superhero films that we've seen in the modern era, or even of all time, I don't quite put Wonder Woman in the top tier. It's close, believe me. It is a fantastic movie, but some of the other movies have really set new standards. Now, it's hard to say what is truly top tier because it is so subjective. My opinion for what is top tier is definitely going to be different than your opinion or someone else's opinion. And we can at least agree on some of the recent comic book movies, though, and these are ones that you see in pretty much all of the top 10 lists, movies like Iron Man and Nolan's Dark Knight films, because those are ones that really did set the stage for where we are today. The last 10 years have really been driven by those movies. But the ones that we still talk about, or the ones we will talk about for years, they're so important because they're the ones that broke cliches like Wonder Woman did as a fundamental execution. Now, as odd as it sounds, Wonder Woman having a female lead is revolutionary enough on its own, because it just helps that it's also a fun and well-crafted movie, but just having her as the lead is revolutionary in the superhero genre that we know it. But I'm sure you're asking why we're even talking about this or why you should care. Well, that's the point of this show. I'm saying these are questions that you didn't even know you cared about. But like it or not, this is the sad reality, but like it or not, comic book movies, superhero films, have been the foundation of pop culture for nearly 2 decades in cinema, with little sign that they will be going away anytime soon. That is just the reality that we live in. In the late 90s, early 2000s, we saw a resurgence in comic book properties, starting with the first X-Men film. Now, that was not the first comic book movie to come out, but it was the first one to really kick off the modern era. We had movies like Batman and Robin, we had Blade, we had those kind of movies that were coming out in the late 90s, but none of them were really the kind of sticking point movies that X-Men was when it came out in 2000. And as more properties were developed, a lot of the movies started to have similar feelings to them. They were all origin stories of some random character, whether you had Spider-Man, Daredevil, Ghost Rider, the Fantastic Four, all these different characters. They were all like origin stories, basically. And it was starting to get a little bit stale. The ones that really stood out, though, were the ones that told the stories better, the ones that were better written, like Spider-Man 2 was definitely a better written story than some of what we had seen. Others tried new things, like Ang Lee's Hulk, which I personally enjoy, but I understand why people didn't like it, and it didn't translate into a success because it was a little too out there, and it didn't quite tap into what was the norm for comic book movies during that time, which was much more popcorn than introspection, which is what Ang Lee's Hulk was. It was a lot more introspection. But it wasn't long before we started asking when the fatigue would set in. I mean, I remember people talking about superhero fatigue back in the mid 2000s, especially when you had movies like Superman Returns and X-Men The Last Stand, which all just felt stale. It felt like stuff that we had seen before and done before, and we were over it at that point. But then along comes the MCU and completely changes the game. Iron Man wasn't extraordinary because it was completely original, because again, this was just an origin story. It was something that we had seen before, we had seen it again and again. But what made it different is because it perfected the origin story, and only it could. And you'll probably disagree with me on that, but the reality is I think it did. I think it perfected the origin story that we had seen played time and time again before that with movies like Daredevil and Spider-Man. But only this one could have worked the way that it did because it had the perfect combination of director, lead actor, and the writing. Everything about it came from those elements. And it was so good, it is really impossible for us to imagine anyone as Iron Man other than Robert Downey Jr. Like, think about it. Who else could you see as Iron Man? It's hard now because now when you think of Iron Man, you're not even thinking of the comics. You're thinking of Robert Downey Jr. But it also set the stage for one of the most ambitious cinematic projects we've ever seen, which is the MCU. Now, I knew it would be big. I just had no idea how successful it truly would be. Like, when I saw Iron Man and saw what they were doing, I knew it was going to be something new and something big, but I really did not expect it to be as big as it has been, as much as it's grown. Because the project was a risk, and it continued to feel like a risk up until the first Avengers film. Iron Man was really the only exceptional film out of those first five, which included Iron Man 2, Thor, Captain America, and The Incredible Hulk. What? Can't believe I forget. I always forget The Incredible Hulk. But even by the time we got up until that Avengers film, we were even asking, are we fatigued yet? Are we even going to survive to get to that assembly film? Could we make it to the Avengers? But then the Avengers came out and just annihilated the box office, as well as being just a fun, entertaining movie. That's the reason it destroyed the box office. But even when Avengers came out, it begged the question whether they would break from the formula. Because while Avengers was a huge hit, a lot of that came from the fact it was a team assembly film. It was one that, pulled these characters together that we had already established over 5 movies and brought them finally together to fight, one enemy. But ultimately, the movie itself did not stray from the formula very far. The action and the comedy certainly helped make it more entertaining than any of the movies before it, but you still had the overblown third act with a faceless horde enemy, and as much as I love Loki, he kind of was a weak villain because he wasn't a true villain. He was one of those villains like, you're evil, but God, I like you. So what is a great superhero film? If I'm talking about movies like Iron Man and the Avengers, what do I actually consider to be the top tier of superhero films, or movies that I feel like really stepped out of the genre and stepped out of the cliches enough to distinguish themselves? So let's look at a few of those films that have arguably had or will have an incredible impact on the genre. Iron Man came out the same year as another movie that made me question the simplicity of superhero movies. It wasn't formulaic, it didn't have an outrageous third act, and it wasn't a CGI slugfest. It's not perfect, but despite the fact, we're still talking about it today like it came out yesterday, and that film was The Dark Knight. So first up, we're talking about The Dark Knight. Now, I don't need to tell you this. The Dark Knight was not a superhero film. It was a crime drama. And while we had seen Batman fight a brain-stealing Riddler and a blue-skinned Arnold Iceman, we were never short on spectacle before Christopher Nolan's films, and it's not hard to argue that the sensory overload called Batman and Robin nearly destroyed the character of Batman, also bat nipples. It was just not a good movie. It was such a bad film and so campy and cheesy, and I think it took it to a degree that just people got kind of sick of that much spectacle. So when Nolan took a crack at Batman with Batman Begins, he put his own ominous touch on the franchise. We kind of got back to more of the darker Tim Burton version of Batman that we had seen. At that point, though, when Nolan directed Batman Begins, he wasn't the major director that we know now. Now, Nolan is absolutely a household name, but back then, he only had small mystery dramas like Memento and Insomnia under his belt, and movies like The Following. He wasn't as well known, and Memento is probably his biggest hit. But Batman Begins was a success because it told the story with a more grounded and human touch. Now, granted, it still had some typical superhero moments, thanks to David S. Goyer, which don't even get me started on that guy. It definitely stuck out as a more patient origin story than some of the ones we've seen. Patient in terms of kind of showing us more about Batman. It delved into the morality about who he is and who he is as a symbol and the place he has in Gotham. It wasn't just, he was bitten by a bat and became a crime fighter type of thing, or just to avenge his parents. There was a little bit more darkness and a little bit more development in that. So even though the movie is very fast paced, it is patient as well. Going into The Dark Knight, though, we expected the same sort of story and feeling. But within the first 10 minutes of that film, we got something completely new. It started off with a heist, similar to how Batman Forever starts, but it wasn't cartoonish and wasn't over the top. It was calculating and precise. It was more like watching a movie like Michael Mann's Heat, which is one of the best crime dramas ever. And that's actually what Nolan was going for, and it paid off. It worked. Because suddenly there were new possibilities for comic book movies. The stories themselves on the page had been doing this for years. It's not like this is a new concept of crossing genres and taking something, that's creative and outrageous and actually putting it into a more real context. The comics and books have done this for years, but on film, they hadn't really had the courage to try this genre crossover. So The Dark Knight really kind of stepped into a new territory for cinema, at least. It's also easier to do it in written form because the audience has time to consume it versus a movie, which is immediate. But the way that Nolan created it, it made it easier to digest. And the movie itself showed us that we could expect a level of creativity on the screen, the same kind that we could see in the comics or in books. So it isn't just about Batman chasing the Joker, that old paradigm. The plot is basically that. It's Batman trying to stop the Joker. But it's also about the Joker challenging the idea of Batman on a philosophical and moral level, about challenging the Batman that was established in Batman Begins. So Nolan's Batman is not just, the beat 'em up kind of Batman, solve the mystery. It's a Batman who really sticks to his ethics and his morals, despite what people will say. His morals are that he is not going to kill people. Obviously, the Joker is testing that. And as an audience, it gives us pause to consider these questions as well, looking at the more philosophical side of Batman. Now, The Dark Knight is far from a perfect movie. I understand that. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the best movie ever, but it was absolutely a starting point for reshaping what comic book movies could be. And let's face it, Heath Ledger's Joker is still one of the finest performances we've ever seen in a comic book film, nay, if one of the best villains we've seen on screen in the last 20 years. So The Dark Knight set a new standard, and that's why it's one of those that we keep coming back to. Another movie, though, is Captain America Winter Soldier, which broke the trend in the MCU of movies with similar paradigms. The first Captain America film was stylistically a very fun throwback to the action genre of like the 1950s. Joe Johnston, who also directed The Rocketeer, colored that film with the veneer of the classics, and it felt like one of those movies. It felt like, the old, you hear the old-timey radio guy talking about, the Superman. It was one of those just like really fun throwback kind of things. But it was also just an origin story, right in line with Iron Man and Thor, with the same kind of ending, with the big bad fighting on a mountain kind of thing. It so much of it was just the paradigm that we had seen. So when Captain America the Winter Soldier was about to be released, the hype was not very strong, and even I'll admit the previews did not make it look like it was going to be anything special. And especially based on the experience with the first film, it seemed like we were due to get another formulaic story. But, much like The Dark Knight, Captain America the Winter Soldier took the foundation of a comic book movie and added a new dynamic to it. But unlike being a crime thriller, this one was a political thriller. Now, a lot of that comes from the strength of the writing and the acting, particularly from Robert Redford, who has himself been in a number of political thrillers over the years, including movies like All the President's Men and 3 Days of the Condor, and why can't I think of the other one? It's like For the Lions or something like that. But basically, so Robert Redford has been in political movies like this, so just having him was enough to really cement that feeling. But one of the things that this movie really did was it started to ask questions about how superheroes fit into a real world. Essentially, how would they function in a world with a capable government? Would they really be considered an asset, or would they actually be a threat? And it's funny to me that this was really never a question before on film. You have like J. Jonah Jameson talking about Spider-Man in, those movies, but it wasn't to the degree that we were looking at it from the government's perspective about how superheroes exist. And while there was some here and there in X-Men, Captain America really actually took the cartoonishness out of the government part of it and gave us a little bit more darkness there and a little bit more reality than we had seen in the X-Men movies. And what's funny is that the movie before this, or the 2 movies before this, was Iron Man 3, which painted the government really as cartoonish. You have the president as just almost as like cartoon character in Iron Man 3. But Winter Soldier brings government logic to the superhero story. And they ask the questions like, how is this good for our country? How can we use this to protect ourselves? And like so many great political thrillers of the past, there's a deal with the devil that creates this moral conundrum. Now, the beautiful thing about Captain America the Winter Soldier is that while it does have this political touch, it doesn't lose sight of its main character. And it actually enhances the main character from anything we had seen previously with Captain America. The conflict that he is fighting, i.e. his relationship with Bucky, is integral to the strength of his story. And it is so well written and executed by the actors that Cap's stock in the MCU explodes with just one movie. Before, he was really the secondary character to Iron Man. Like, I cared more about Thor than I cared about Captain America going into this film. But this movie changed who he is as a character in a big way. And when you combine the political intrigue with a well-constructed personal story, you get Captain America the Winter Soldier, which is something we might not see done as well as this was done for a long time. Civil War tried, but it didn't achieve what Captain America the Winter Soldier did with less. Now, the third one I want to talk about, and this one is probably a little more controversial just because of how new it is, but Logan. Logan will undoubtedly go down as one of the finest superhero movies because of how much it isn't one. This is different than the other two because this movie has so much more behind it. Sure, we had numerous film and TV versions of Batman, and Captain America the Winter Soldier was the 9th film in the MCU franchise when it came out, the 3rd one with Captain America. But this was the 10th time Hugh Jackman played the character of Logan, the Wolverine. We have been watching one actor portray this role since 2000, kind of like Robert Downey Jr. with Iron Man. It's hard to imagine anybody but Hugh Jackman playing Wolverine. And arguably, X-Men was the movie that really set off the modern era of superhero films, thanks in large part to both Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart's Professor X. They really stole that show and got people really interested in what they could do with superhero films. So after 9 appearances in 17 years, there's something endearing about both the character and the actor. And so just going into Logan, you have a lot behind it. Now, the film itself is Jackman's last hurrah with the character. Now, we will likely see Wolverine again on film, but it won't be Jackman. There are always ways to handle saying farewell to a beloved character or to a beloved actor who's playing that character. There's the ride off into the sunset, fake their own death like The Dark Knight Rises, or they just keep on trucking. They just keep doing what they're doing, and maybe there will be a sequel in the future. But Logan certainly says farewell in a big way, but the journey is unlike what you'd expect for a superhero film. The story itself takes inspiration from the Old Man Logan storyline in the comics, where he's old, his body is breaking down, all his friends are gone, he's just a wreck. And this alone is a remarkable setup for the character, because how often do we get to see age in superhero films? It never happens. The Dark Knight Rises showed us some age, but it didn't really last very long, whereas this is the entire movie of just showing how much age has ravaged these characters that we've come to know and love. It doubles down on how much he's deteriorated over the years. And what's also cool about it is this movie has the feeling of a Western. Much like movies like Unforgiven and Shane, it's a near future setting, so there's some sci-fi technology in it, but not so much that it's like when you think of like Days of Future Past when they're in the future, that's what you would think of about the future. You wouldn't think of this just like dusty, rural type of setting, but that's what they give us. This is the future that they're presenting now. And Logan is the crusty old guy, and so is Patrick Stewart, who reprises his role as Charles, and is probably his last role as Charles Xavier. And they're both thrust into their old roles unwillingly when a young girl is brought into their lives. Like I said, Unforgiven, there are so many parallels to that movie. Like, it's amazing how well he crafted this movie using a movie like Unforgiven as a blueprint. And I'm sure whether it's intentional or not, it's definitely there. But it's also a welcome thing because it's such a well-told story. And yeah, there's plenty of action, so it's still a superhero movie in that regard, but it never goes over the top. It's gorier than we've seen, but that's because it's the first R-rated X-Men movie, outside of Deadpool, I guess. But there's no silver samurai at the end. There's no fight on top of a nuclear power plant. There's no giant jets and stuff like that. It's all on the ground. It's all fisticuffs kind of fighting. It just never gets really over the top. It's more stunt-based and that kind of action-based. But what also makes this movie so good and what will endure from it is how well it ends the story for one of our most endearing actor-character combos in the modern era. So even though Logan is still very fresh in our minds, it will likely be referenced for years to come, because it's going to stand as an example of how, even in a genre that is normally very cut and dry, there can still be depth and drama. And I don't mean in a sense of like Unbreakable, which is a secret superhero movie, so it's hard for me to put that in the same category, because Unbreakable is one of those where the twist is that it's a superhero movie. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a movie you know is a superhero movie with established, beloved characters that can be put into deeper stories, much like this, where we see Logan and Charles in something that's a little bit more dramatic, a little more personal, and not nearly as over the top as we've seen. Logan proves that it proves that. And that's why this movie, I believe, will be in our collective consciousness for years to come. Now, I should also give honorable mention to another movie that has really broken the cliches, and that's Deadpool, because of how crazy successful it was. I cannot go without mentioning it, but it's not. I wouldn't put it in the same category as these other three movies, because the movie itself is about as cliche as you can get in terms of a story. But much like Iron Man, Ryan Reynolds embodies that role like no one else could. But it's violent, it's dirty, and it's fairly accurate representation of the character, with the fourth wall breaking and just the general zinginess. And so much of the impact comes from the comedy in that film. But it's also spurred on the conversation about R-rated comic book movies. And it's not like this is the first R-rated comic book movie, or that Logan happened because this was rated R. Because there were tons of R-rated comic book movies, like the Punisher movies, like Watchmen, Constantine. But what this one did was it opened an avenue that wasn't explored as much thanks to the massive success of PG-13 friendly movies like in the MCU. So we'll certainly see how that impacts comic book movies in the future. I know Kevin Feige was talking about potentially an R-rated Marvel movie, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will happen. But that's a conversation that, because of the massive success of Deadpool, it's going to happen. It's very likely that we will see more R-rated movies. Like I said, we already seen it with Logan. So Like it or not, comic book movies are the currency of the modern movie industry, and they will continue to be as long as the public continues to watch them with such fervor. Now, that doesn't mean they all have to be the same. In fact, the only way for us to stave off that inevitable fatigue is with variety. The DCEU continues to try to capture the tone that Nolan's trilogy achieved. Now, to this point, they haven't been able to do so because a movie like Batman v Superman went too far. It's too grim now. So that means what they need to do is take the base concept of a superhero film and make it something more, or take a chance on something radical. And that's why Wonder Woman worked. Although it's painful to think of a superhero film led by a woman as radical, sadly that is the reality. Or in the case of Deadpool, making something naughty. There's a reason we still talk about a movie like The Dark Knight even after almost 10 years. It really did show us we can expect more from a superhero movie than just the simple paradigm. And every time a movie breaks that formula, like Wonder Woman did, like Deadpool did, like Logan did, it makes the swath of comic book movies more tolerable and welcome, assuming they don't fall into that old paradigm and then become stale. All right, before we go, June is Pride Month, and that matters to everyone, because even though it isn't officially recognized this year, people are observing it and they are celebrating it. There's going to be parades, speeches, concerts, events, the whole 9 yards. There's even a Pride flag react on Facebook, which I have been using probably in excess. Pride is, though, at its core, a celebration of freedom and courage, but there is still a very, very, very long way to go in the fight for fair and equal treatment for LGBTQIA people. The community does not have an official holiday. There's no Harvey Milk Day, there's no Stonewall Remembrance that is officially recognized by the government. In fact, since the 2016 election, more states are introducing anti-LGBTQIA legislation than ever before. And just today, we've seen that happen in Kentucky. Even after the North Carolina backlash, these guys are undeterred, and it's disturbing. But more and more legislatures are talking about fighting SCOTUS on the ruling on marriage, which is another thing that just is ridiculous. So even with all this hate and everything that's coming at people, why are they so adamant about celebrating Pride, even if they're still so marginalized? Well, Pride is a simultaneous celebration of self and otherness, and that's something we all need to do. We are not the center of the universe, but we're also not faceless. Pride celebrates strength instead of fear. People who participate in Pride are not giving into fear. People who use that opportunity to celebrate who they are people who are not giving into that fear. And that's what we all need to do, is fight against fear. And a lot of this anti-LGBT stuff is coming from a place of fear. There are plenty of reasons to distrust the world. Just watch the news for 5 minutes. But living in fear isn't just a sad state of mind, it's also bad for your health. So, with Pride, just use this as an opportunity to say no to fear, because why not say no to fear? Pride is an example of millions of people celebrating how they said no to fear. Isn't that something we should all be doing anyway? If the most marginalized groups in this country are willing to celebrate and show their courage, why can't we all? Why can't we all say no to fear? Hate is not love, just like fear is not strength, and Pride can teach us all this lesson. Thanks a lot for watching. I know it's been a while. Again, I've been trying to figure out what I want to do with this show, but I think I might have a better angle on it. So let me know. Give me some feedback if you like this. It's pretty much going to be, 1 or 2 topics, mostly pop culture related, because I love talking about movies and TV and stuff like that. So let me know what you think about it. But hopefully, again, I will get to be a little bit more regular with this podcast. I don't want to get rid of it because there's so many things I can do with it. But thanks a lot for watching, or if you're listening to it on podcast, thank you for doing it that way. So that's all for this episode, but I shall return. Be sure to subscribe to Paved With Good Intentions on YouTube or on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher for all episodes past and future. You can also check out the links below to my other podcast, Translation, as well as my YouTube channel. You can visit my webpage, dkessner.com, for all of my various works. And if you have any questions, comments, or a topic you want me to mull over, or if you want your voice on the podcast so we can argue about pop culture, send me an email at translationpodcast@gmail.com, because I do want to hear from you and your unique perspectives. Again, this podcast is produced sponsor-free, so thank you for supporting independent artists, and I'll see you on the other side.